Projection. Projection exists where consciousness unknowingly allows itself to view an aspect of its surroundings without distinguishing between subjectivity and objectivity. Understand the twofold existence of all psychic matter. First, all psychic matter exists in an objective manner. Second, all psychic matter exists in a subjective manner. The objective manner refers to the situation of particular matter in relation to universal mind, which, through being an unchanging entity itself, does not see in any way other than what any given manifestation is in relation to all else. The subjective manner refers to the view of any given psychic matter in relation to any other psychic matter. Any given entity is bound to a relative and subjective existence, where its appearance is largely dependent on the nature of that which is viewing it. In the objective view, any entity of a position of greater universality relative to another may hold a degree of archetypal significance to that other. Projection takes place where an entity, having increasingly closed off its consciousness, loses the awareness that anything exists outside of or beyond its own consciously known existence. It becomes blind to the possibility that representations of unconsciously desired influences can stem into the consciousness. To view subjectively is to understand the object of the view as what it is to the viewer. This is as opposed to the objective view, which appreciates that the object's existence extends beyond the view of the viewing entity. Any object of view holds both realities, and the realities require a certain balancing in the viewing entity in order that the viewing entity receives an influence from the object of view that is accurate to the needs of the unconscious existence that requested the interaction. That balancing cannot take place without a simultaneous understanding of the entity as being both these things at once. The subjective view allows the entity to see the object of view as it pleases. This view must be checked by the viewing entity's understanding of the object of view as it actually is, so that the correct expectation of action of the object of view comes into being. The object of view is unaware of the extent of what it imparts to the viewer. What it imparts might consist of very little to do with itself, and much to do with the viewing entity hearing the voice of deep unconsciousness speaking indirectly through the object of view. If the viewing entity is able to allow archetypal matter into his environment while keeping in mind the separation of unconsciously derived matter and consciously derived matter, then the entity can gain in his comprehension of what the various aspects of his environment represent. The viewing entity can then see that it is not just in dream or through relaxation of the consciousness that he can view that which goes beyond current consciousness. Just as it is the case that in dreams certain situations might be representations of something else, so too can situations in life be representations of something else. Further, it is the case that what a certain situation represents today can be different from what it represents tomorrow. The difference will depend on how the relation of the viewer has changed in relation to the viewed. The path. Rebirth is the awakening of mind to the realms of subjective consciousness and objective consciousness. Rebirth allows a mind to constructively begin the process of learning the structure of discourse between the unconscious and the conscious. The mind learns first that it knows very little and must stretch to discover the meaning of all that was so recently unavailable to its view. In this situation, the mind is deluged with an onrush of unfamiliar psychic matter. What has taken place is that some of the mists surrounding the consciousness have receded and opened to the viewing entity a vista of new landscape that was previously invisible and unknown. In such revelatory moments, what is, relatively speaking, objectively insignificant is, to the mind of the entity, such a breakthrough that it may think it has achieved something close to enlightenment. What an entity in this situation has failed to comprehend is that it is hardly any further along than before. The same thing could happen continually for an eternity without the individual ever experiencing the absolute notion of enlightenment they supposedly yearn for. However, in the subjective sense, these are revelations and must be seen as such if more are to be brought about. Even though the particular revelation might be of infinitely minor scope, as relative to the scope of universal mind, that does not mean it is not necessarily without import. That is because it is not as relative to universal mind that the particular revelation takes place. Rather, it is in the infinitely more particularized subjective existence of the entity. At this level, the experience may hold significance of an infinite scope, even though that infinite scope remains limited. What has taken place through revelation is a receding of mists, which means a heightening of awareness. Heightening of awareness cannot take place without the completion of a guided action that is designed to bring about particular influence, and therefore a particular change at the level and location of the manifested existence in question. The enlargement of personality is the process of receiving subjective revelation and gradually increasing conscious awareness through action designed to sweep mists further from the center of consciousness. This clarifying action must take place with balance taken into account so as to avoid an imbalance in that which is open to view. Imbalance of clarity is avoided through the action of the imagination and the action of reason. Imagination probes the mists and sends back information that is then analyzed by the rational faculty at the center of the individual consciousness. With the findings from these analyses, the rational mind can then direct further probing by the imagination in order to fill gaps in hypotheses, or further to prove or disprove set hypotheses. Throughout this process, as the rational mind works with the imaginative mind, the mists recede further and the conscious mind enlarges to the point of taking into account much that was previously known only at unconscious levels of mind. Depending on the nature of the consciousness in question, a different result will come about. The actions of the imagination serve two functions. First, to blindly explore the boundary realms of the individual consciousness, and to report on its findings to the reasoning faculty. Through this action, the reasoning faculty of the mind in question is able to discern the extents of what it knows in these directions, but also catch glimpses of what it does not know. The roving of the imagination is, in this case, relatively non-directed, like routine patrols. There is much that can be discovered through these patrols that the reasoning faculty might not have come across through imaginative searching subject to a greater degree of direction. The importance of this non-guided roving of the imagination is to take in that which the reasoning faculty does not know to look for. What will come about through this will be a slow increase in general awareness of the areas all around the borders of consciousness. The attentions of the imagination into the misty borders of unconsciousness would remain relatively even and balanced around the center of consciousness, were they not also directed by the reasoning faculty that responds both to the information gathered through these routine patrols and to findings made through penetrations into the unconscious as specifically directed by the reasoning faculty. For a deep dispersal, energy must be focused to a singular point. Energy spread out over a wide area loses its concentration, and its penetrating strength is lessened. It is because of this that a certain balance must be upheld. If an entity seeks to view powerfully in one area on the basis of the assumption that it knows what it seeks, then it must focus its attention accordingly. But if that entity has made a miscalculation in its reasoning, it then discovers that it has directed all its energy in one direction to the exclusion of all others. The moment the conscious attention is turned, the mists of the unconscious begin to roll in to cover what was clear with cloud. The contents of the cloud are unknown, and if left unattended, they may threaten to overtake the center of the consciousness while the attentions of that consciousness are directed elsewhere. The focused attention of a finite entity in one direction necessitates an exclusion of attention in other directions. Only a limited amount of conscious growth can occur through undirected imagination. It is the reasoning faculty that discerns patterns within that which the imagination uncovers. The discerning of pattern allows for a faster expansion of clarity and hastens the growth of consciousness through the prediction of that which is still unconscious. If the reasoning faculty has acted with care, then the entity can direct its gaze to clear the clouds surrounding exactly that which was expected to be hidden there. In this way, great swathes of unconscious matter can become conscious following just a few well-guided directions of the reasoning faculty. The entity must understand that it takes energy to marshal its viewing powers, and energy to penetrate the cloud of unconsciousness. It must understand how to expand consciousness while using the least amount of energy. The entity must allow freedom to the imagination to roam at will, without the active direction of the reasoning faculty. This is because the imagination sometimes finds what is most important without rational direction. Necessarily, as the entity takes more of existence into its consciousness, more of existence falls into that entity's scope of influence. The entity is gained in terms of lifespan, both spatially and temporally. In gaining, it has moved closer to absolute influence, that which is relevant to all existence both temporally and spatially. Immortality means to not be subject to death. Immortality refers directly to a state of oneness with the entire universe. The achievement of immortality cannot come about from delving primarily into the unconscious. The achievement cannot take place unless the faculty of reason seeks to familiarize itself not simply with a general sense of finitude, but also with a direct sense of infinitude. If immortality is to be attained, any entity that would attain it must do so from a state that offers such a position. That state would have to be a state infinitesimally close to universal consciousness. Psychic matter is bound by laws that give to its finitude a psychic body that allows interaction through consciousness. Psychic matter cannot transcend the laws that govern it without transcending its own existence. But the sweeping away of mists is gradual and eternal. Only slowly do the clouds recede from the borders of consciousness, and only through the careful and long engagement of the rational mind and the imaginative mind. This is a process of temporal evolution that must take place before ultimate transcendence can occur. Exploration. Now you shall enter into an exploration to determine the nature of reason, to see its structure, the way it works, and its limits in terms of what it can be expected to do. This inquiry into reason will be to see what it is and what it is not capable of achieving. Also, in the case of what it is capable of achieving, in what ways it might achieve it. To begin, you must understand the common shortfalls of reason. First, your ability to reason is, due to your limited nature, necessarily limited. Second, particularized reason falls short of being universally applicable. An attempt at particular knowledge in any given situation using mistaken reason will inevitably result in failure of reason to carry the reasoning entity all the way to its goal. By contrast, correct reasoning will bring the reasoning entity to its goal. The goal of the reasoning entity is the desired conscious understanding. If the applicable logic of the desired conscious understanding is beyond the capability of the entity, then the entity will necessarily make mistakes in reasoning that will prevent it from immediately achieving the particular goal. So long as the reasoning entity wants to know success, it must not reach too far ahead or it will be subject to failure. You cannot assume absolute reason. Any use of a set particularized reason towards an unattained understanding will bring about fallacy. This is due to the changing state of reason as a particularized version of something that is, in essence, absolute. Reason changes and takes a shape of knowable form so as to be perceivable to that which is perceiving it, an entity that is limited. In the case that an incorrect use of reason has been made, the user of reason does not have any way of knowing his fault until it reaches failure, or at least not until the landscape differs from the desired such that his suspicions are aroused. So long as there is a particular goal in mind, the user of reason must be careful to use reasoning correct to its situation. This entails a continuing reassessment of the entity's understanding of reason as it pertains to that with which it is interacting. No particular user of reason has access to the full scope of reason at any given time. Each entity exists with access to a certain set of concepts within its understanding. Through the comprehension of these concepts, the entity can structure its understanding such that further manifestation relating to that understanding can be recognized and experienced. If the entity is not prepared for any given experience due to a lack of pre-existing understanding, then the experience will be meaningless. Any reasoning entity is limited to a set of potential experience, as is and will be relevant and necessary to the energy it manifests through its existence. In endeavoring in various directions, the manifested entity comes across the strengths and weaknesses of its particular existence. There are two ways of confronting weaknesses. First, the entity may refrain from heading in those directions where difficulties are apparent. Second, the entity may directly attend to those weaknesses in order to strengthen and remove them. The entity must engage in an exploration of itself whenever it attends itself to anything. In order for the entity to attend itself, it must communicate with the relevant aspects of itself in order to influence those aspects to act. If the entity lacks understanding of the various aspects of itself that it seeks to influence, the communication will be hindered and the expected action will not meet the intention. This is a state of relative inefficiency in the entity. In any organization of energies towards the completion of a set task, it is necessary to the efficient completion of that task that the directing force understands the nature and specialities of the faculties and energies at its disposal. Only then may the desired action be completed in an effective manner. In light of this, you must understand your reasoning faculty, its relationship to imagination, and how it manifests that which was pure imagination into rational structure. You will find, through exploration, that the faculty of reason has the ability to travel outside of the spheres of your direct physical experiential existence. This is the exploration of reason into the mists at the borders of consciousness, and it is the gradual comprehension by reason of what it has discovered there. Reason's exploration is based in understanding that is rooted in the experience of the mind and body. Understanding that is rooted in the experience of the mind derives from knowledge that has grown according to rules and principles developed and understood through its very growth, separate from, though perhaps informed by, all other experience. It is knowledge that comes about through necessity of principle, and is not fundamentally derived from experience in the physical sense, nor from an analysis of aspects of physically embodied existence. In any pursuit of knowledge, you must employ that which you know. Through reason, the individual mind becomes aware of necessary patterns of embodiment. Once the mind has distilled its attentions towards knowledge of greater clarity, these patterns become apparent through what is already known. At this level, the mind views the nature of the various aspects of its knowledge, and can see how, from this root level, the knowledge branches into different forms of greater particularization. The root level signifies a level of collectivity and universality of existence. Through awareness of the root and of the ways in which it can be seen to necessarily branch, it becomes possible to discern probabilities in the context of the existence of further branches of greater particularity. The viewing entity perceives only objects that may be contemplated. To any viewing entity there exists an infinitude of such objects. The entity perceives such objects through its sensory awareness, not just of the sensory faculties of body, but the sensory awareness of psychical existence. To comprehend that which is available to its view, the entity applies its reasoning faculty and constructs concepts of understanding so as to order its understanding into usable form. It is through this interaction at the higher levels of reason, the relation of thought and concept, that the entity itself, as a totality, is able to discern both the nature of any given perceived matter and how such matter interrelates so as to apply itself in those directions that are of most relevance at any given time. All perceived objects of view are essentially bound by time and space. In order to appreciate the workings of higher reason, it is necessary to understand the relational mediums by which those objects of attention function. Space and time. Understand space as being infinite in terms of its extent of manifested embodiment. Space, though infinite, is not absolutely infinite. It shows distinct finitude as it represents a distinct embodiment of existence. Space, as distinct from time, does not refer to a consecutive chain of events, but rather to a simultaneous existence of diverse matter. Space cannot embrace all of the matter to which it relates without being conjoined with time. This is because the extent of space occurs over the course of time, not merely at a given point in time. Space is necessarily infinitely limited by the removal of consecutive existence. Within and despite this finitude, space as distinct from time demonstrates a complete and infinitely diverse embodiment of manifestation. Any given perspective existing as an aspect of space, within such a field of manifestation, is necessarily limited. Perceptive entities bear temporal existence, and cannot comprehend the extent of what it is to see in a manner that excludes temporality. In order to fully comprehend space as distinct from time, an entity must embody a greater degree of objectivity than it possibly can. An entity may, however, employ the faculty of imagination to comprehend such an object to a limited degree. Without time, infinite manifestation is seen in stasis, all embodied into an interlocking web of frozen interaction. With time, that web of infinite interaction undergoes an infinite diversity of change, such that a flux of absolute constancy occurs in which nothing remains spatially the same even for an infinitely small period of time. Just as a given entity's comprehension of space is limited to that which is related to and which energetically resembles to some extent the comprehending entity, so too is that entity's understanding of time. The entity's understanding will always be limited to the extent required in order that the comprehending entity is not overwhelmed. Relevance of manifestation is key to the experience of any given entity. In temporal terms, the mind is more flexible than the body. Although it moves through time with the body, the mind is able to explore time to some extent non-linearly. In this way, time exhibits a greater degree of constancy and universality at the level of mind than at the level of body. The reason for this is that time will hold a degree of constancy and universality relevant to the degree of constancy and universality experienced by the given entity in question. As different as any given entity is as relative to another, so too will be its experience of time. And because particular entities are infinitely diverse in their experience of time, time shows infinite difference from one entity to another. Time itself must be understood like space as being of infinite proportion and extent, even though the experience of time by any particular entity is finite. Time and space are the bases of manifested existence. Manifested existence includes psychic existence, which includes the faculty of imagination from which thought is derived. From thought comes the conceptual seeds of understanding. These conceptual seeds are not free from indirect sensible influence, nor from direct psychic influence. All manifested understanding is thus subject to the measure of time and space pertinent to the entity that holds the understanding. Conceptual constructs underlying that entity's understanding may exist at a fundamental point as relevant to that entity, but those same constructs are attainable through derivative means. To explore that which is hidden through the constraints of any given time and space relationship, you must take on a situation less constrained by the particularization of each. Any considerations of concepts of pure understanding exist in a time-constrained manner, in that the mind is controlled by consciousness in a temporally linear construct, and any conceptual seed of understanding must be decipherable by the language of the mind in order to take on contemplatable existence. Conceptual seeds also exist spatially, as abstracts within the reasoning faculty of the intellect. These abstract conceptual seeds embody a situation of time and space that is less finite than the more immediate generalized surrounding existence. If a given entity attends itself to deciphering and interacting with that which exists at such levels of lesser finitude, it finds that its experience of space and time takes on an embodiment less affected by space and time than were its attention directed into that which is to a greater degree affected by space and time. Through the journey into concepts of pure understanding, the reasoning faculty contemplates the roots of consciously known embodied existence, and can thereby comprehend the necessity of any given aspect of its consciously known embodied existence. The establishment of concept-based understanding allows more subtle surrounding experience to be recognized and comprehended. The objects of concept-based understanding are an integral part of the nature of any given entity's existence. Any entity of existence necessarily has these concepts within its potential of understanding, and it is by means of these concepts that empirical experience is possible and meaningful. If a given entity has not established concept-based understanding to lay ground for a given experience, then that entity cannot recognize and comprehend the experience. This preparation is not always conscious. The mind must unconsciously undergo such establishment of understanding constantly. In that much of existence is ruled unconsciously, there is a complexity of necessary embodiment beyond that of conscious awareness and attention. The depth of the unconscious is infinite, but whereas a less complex consciousness attends itself to more basic matters necessary to satisfy another basic unconscious necessity, that being its need to perpetuate its own existence, the more complex consciousness has used its heightened awareness of the workings of manifestation in order to bring about some degree of automatic satisfaction as regards those basic needs. Once that is accomplished, the energy with which it might have otherwise attended itself to more basic matters can now be directed towards the higher realms of its own ability and reason, those being the realms of thought and concept. The entity can by these means find itself in a position of greater collectivity, through the application of itself to matters whose result transcend the short-term need, and are able then to take into account that which did, does, or will take place, either locally or at relevant distance away. The entity thus extends itself through its reach in both time and space. It remains necessary for the attentions of the consciousness to remain at the basic levels of its existence to some extent, in case of the failure of some aspect of its self-designed mechanisms of basic perpetuation. But while some attentions of thought seek knowledge through the contemplation of concept, other attentions of thought can apply such knowledge to its relevant existence on the basis of necessity as comprehended by way of concept-based understanding. It is through this indirect means that matters of the entity's basic existence can be attended to. More importantly, it is through this method that the mists of unconsciousness can be pierced and the entanglements of mind disentangled, thus to clarify the content of mind through conceptual necessity. The entity must take care, as the further the mind delves into conceptual knowledge without a simultaneous application of that knowledge to its basic existence, the further the unconscious may sweep over the forgotten aspects of basic perpetuation. If this rise of the unconscious continues, it can extinguish the very means by which the mind has the capability to pursue conceptual understanding, that being its own conscious embodiment. A reasonable balance can be kept between the safekeeping of existing conscious awareness, the application of the knowledge gained through conceptual understanding so as to expand consciousness into that which was previously unconscious, the attention given to the further exploration of those concepts of pure understanding, and the ways by which they can be further employed to bring about further knowledge. If such a balance is kept, the awareness of the entity can increase. Absolute consciousness is the source of all concepts, and any given manifested entity represents one concept. From each concept branches further concepts. By contemplating any given concept, an entity may go on to decipher each next generation of concept as the root concept branches further and further into the realms of the manifested. The mind can in this way determine and presuppose what must necessarily branch from that root. At this level of multiplicity, the extent of influences upon a given entity is infinite. Any given entity exists as a result of the reality of those influences upon its infinite parent concepts, as well as those that act upon it as a distinct entity. For this reason, there is an inherent difficulty in coming to completeness of conceptual understanding through the use of the manifested entity itself. As we remove the limitation of the inherent space and time relationship, we find that we can, from a standpoint of bidirectional temporal experience, see what the manifestation of any given entity must be. This is because any entity is, in effect, all of that from which it comes, in relation to that which views it at any given point or period in time. This view shows that just as events of the present happen as a result of past occurrences, so too do events of the present necessitate events of the past. Through a comprehension of necessity based in concept, it is possible to determine the exact nature of the root of given manifestation, but also those particular instances that form the various generations of concept that stem from that root. From the root concept, each subsequent generation takes on predictable traits, whether viewed in linear time or in its reverse. This comprehension allows not just the determination of the inherent traits of a particular perceived entity, but also the experience that that entity will inevitably undergo, and through a branching of this very same awareness, when and how it will happen. Roots. Any entity comes into being through an hereditary process of evolution. The physical and psychical aspects of manifestation are the result in any given case of this process. That which is required as sustenance for these embodied aspects will show close relevance to the entity in question. First, there will be similarity of physical manifestation from the most basic to the most complex levels of physicality. Second, at the level of mind, the same holds true. The reason for this is that which is similar in value shall necessarily be manifested similarly, as they shall have comparable needs in terms of evolutionary growth. That which is manifested in a certain way is manifested that way due to a need-based determination to evolve towards absolute infinity. From the deepest levels of existence particular to any given entity comes a directive that passes through all levels of energy specific to that entity, including those levels of energy closely relevant to the design of manifestation at the level of mind and physicality. Any entity finds itself involved in particular psychical surroundings, signifying its manifested existence. Within that environment, the entity shall find influence more and less particularly relevant to itself. It is at the level of mind that determinations are made concerning the relative relevance of various potential influences. Subconsciously and consciously, the mind must evaluate what is more or less relevant to itself and direct action according to the need-based directives of the various aspects of its existence. This is an objective process in that the directive of change at this most fundamental level acts in accordance with the desire for a heightening of value. If the mind of an entity loses focus of this directive and allows the balance of influence to shift from the need-based directives of the deeper aspects of its existence to the want-based aspects of its more superficial existence, then that which will be brought into its surroundings through the mental directive for change will be more relevant to the physical, less relevant to the mental, and even less relevant to the deeper levels of its existence. Anything that is manifested as a result of such superficial directives will be increasingly irrelevant to the need-based directive as rooted in the deeper levels of the entity's particular evolutionary line. Internal and external factors have their share of influence. This includes everything from the physical evolutionary construction of the entity to that entity's accumulated experience of its environment. The physical evolutionary construction of the entity consists of the culmination of a stream of ancestral experience coming to a point at the entity's conception. Certain experiences will prove more probable than others to occur, in that certain experiences will prove more relevant to the entity's needs for evolution. These experiences are the keys to discovering the next stage of directed expansion of consciousness. The process of the expansion of consciousness requires that, as each stage of directed expansion is achieved, the entity must seek out the course that will lead to the next stage. By looking within for the next stage, entities may consciously tap into an ongoing subconscious process and become conscious of what it is that the more subtle aspects of consciousness require. The action of consciously becoming aware of this process and then engaging in the psychical and physical resources towards helping to achieve its requirements speeds the process, allowing it to take a position of priority at all levels of the entity. An entity that is unaware of this evolution within itself risks acting according to the influence of external structures that are set into place without regard to the entity's unconscious needs. In this way, these internal needs of the entity in question can stagnate in their resolution. They then harden and hinder future expansion of the entity's consciousness.